Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss Kamala Harris's Media Blitz, a new book from Sohrab Ahmari, and Hollywood's Big Flops, joined by Sohrab Ahmari and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. So Kamala, after months of joyful hiding from the press, and actually quite successful media strategy, has changed course and begun doing a bunch of interviews. We've also seen kind of new blitz of appearances from surrogates, including Barack Obama uh, hitting the trail on her behalf. Geoff, Sohrab, what have you made of the new media strategy from the Harris campaign?
So I'm going to speak about one subset of this blitz, which is outreach specifically to African American men. And you mentioned former President Barack Obama. He's a big part of that. He was in Pennsylvania meeting with groups of black men, and on the whole, the outreach to African American men, which it does sound like they're quite it's a group that they're quite worried about. There was already in 2020 for a Republican candidate, Trump sort of outperformed among black men. Um, there's polls out there suggesting that Kamala only has support among 70% of black men right now. Now, when I say only or just, obviously 70% is a huge number, but again, relative to this particular demographic, which has been historically tied to the Democratic Party, it's a real thing. So it's something that they're worried about, and the outreach to them has been a combination of hectoring and extreme condescension. So let me start on the hectoring side. Former President Obama went to a group of black men and told them essentially that their refusal or their failure to support Kamala Harris in sufficient numbers basically is a psychosexual thing, that they cannot accept a woman, and essentially the problem is misogyny or sexism in the black community. Um, I found that that remark is actually almost as bad, if not worse, than his bitter clingers remark back in 2008. And that point, I think he was talking about white working class people clinging to their guns and their Bible and so on. And now it's directed at black men along the same lines. Instead of listening to what the issues are. I think immigration is this bubbling issue across demographics, but it's especially, in certain blue cities, including where the three of us live in New York City, the effect of migrant shelters and just the surge of migrants in the unskilled labor market, et cetera, is felt heavily by black people. And there's been just a whole bunch of studies going back to at least the 90s that show that mass low wage migration hurts black workers the most. So it's like, instead of listening to that and addressing that seriously, Obama hectors and tells them that black men are basically sexist and bad. They're bad people. And then there's the condescension, which is encapsulated in Kamala's uh, now what she calls her Black Opportunity agenda. And it directly addressed at men. And some of there's 5 items, and they're like spelled out with very little detail. But there's 5 things, and some of them are fine, but at least 2 of them are gimmicky and stupid. One is, we're gonna protect your crypto owner, the crypto that you own. I just, again, this is to all nominees, candidates in office for whatever level, from dog watcher to U.S. president. Like, the share of Americans that own cryptocurrencies is really, really small. It's like a bizarre obsession of actually both Democrats and Republicans, and I know we plan to write about this more, is why are they catering so much? Well, in part because the crypto industry is flooding both parties with donations. I think that's part of it, but it's just a very small share of the population that's even knows what these things are. Like I don't know what, like I don't really know what Bitcoin is. Ultimately, I do. I'm kidding, but just a lot of people aren't engaged with it. And then another one which I found was funny is like legalize marijuana nationally and help black men cash in on the soon to follow marijuana bonanza. Disregarding all the ways in which marijuana is socially destructive. That's neither here nor there. But just the idea that like all these black men are sitting around thinking the thing I need is to become a kind of state supported pot dealer. Um, it's just it reeks of desperation, and it's to be clear, like just that Trump has his own gimmicky versions, but this is just remarkable from a candidate or nominee that, as you said, uh, Matthew, had post presidential debate a pretty disciplined strategy of not talking, um, just sort of letting people project whatever they want onto her, good vibes, brat summer, etc. Once you drill down, and once the campaign is in a crisis mode, and look, I mean, you can go on Real Clear and compare where Biden was at this stage in battleground states with where she is. It's much worse. Like Biden was up zero point 0.5, zero point 0.6, whatever. Those kinds of, he was posting those kinds of polling numbers. She's like barely up in some and down in others. So, they are in trouble, but like once, the rubber hits the road and they have to speak to serious issues, it's like, that combination. And I'm only talking about the black aspect of this, but it's like this kind of condescending, you want to be a pot dealer. We know blacks love pot. We know they're pot people. So let's monetize. It's just this, it's based on a stereotype. It is kind of racist, I think, to my mind. Like the black opportunity agenda, marijuana. What the hell? And then, or heck, lecturing them to you're misogynistic, you're sexist. It's really it's a campaign in trouble at this point, I would say, which was not the case as recently as 2-3 weeks ago.
Let them eat crypto and smoke weed.
I don't know. I'd be slightly skeptical of the idea that they're. I don't know. I think the polling seems to be pretty. It's moved in marginal ways. I think they're. It's hard for me to tell sort of whether this is an act of desperation or just a kind of relatively obvious attempt at outreach in one particular area where they're struggling somewhat. But it's and there's also a lot of debate over how much the polling numbers will really show up in the final results and how big of a shift this will end up being. So to me, it's sort of more notable in terms of this, as you said, avoidance of kind of racial and gender targeted um, policy proposals, and that instead there's kind of a shift to reviving some of that language, which does suggest there's something they're seeing that is making them worry about their retaining this particular segment of the population. But yeah, I suppose what's kind of interesting to me is like both these items, crypto and actually national marijuana legalization, were previous. These are actually more policies that were previously put it in the front of the agenda by the Trump campaign before this. So it's kind of interesting that yet again there's this kind of co-opting of or attempt to just lift policies from the other side. And it's surprising, that you could argue in a parallel way that the Trump, that there was just a piece today that the Trump referred to himself strangely as the father of IVF. So clearly the Harris campaign sees their area of difficulty as being men. The Trump campaign sees their area of difficulty as being women, and so they're both, to some extent, making these kind of these somewhat pandering policies directly at those groups. I'm sort of wondering whether this is desperation on their part or just some kind of new phase of attempting to shore up areas of the coalition that seem weak. It seems maybe less clear to me, but clearly Harris is trying to kind of get out there, and by many accounts, she's attempting to arrange an appearance on Joe Rogan's podcast, which I think would be an interesting spectacle. But she's attempting to sort of get out there and present herself. I sort of think this could be interpreted either as a move of desperation or as a move of greater confidence than she had previously. I think it's all a little bit ambiguous. So I'm not totally sure how to read this media blitz, whether it reflects a kind of clear signal that they think they're struggling and need to shore up their support or face disaster, or whether there's some kind of again sense of entering into the home stretch and needing to kind of up the game, but also perhaps having greater confidence about putting her out there. I don't really know. It's also weird to me because all these narratives are so fragmented and one only and they're so siloed. Depending on who you listen to, all of these events are immediately cast in one way or the other. Their significance is read in one way or the other. But it's an interesting moment, and clearly, that there is some sort of shift on the Harris side in terms of how they're going about campaigning, whatever is causing that, and it will be interesting to see, what the result of this this attempt to kind of get out there and present herself to the public more fully will be after this kind of strange period of attempting to just be all things to all people, and which I think she is still kind of doing.
Just very quickly to say, like, point taken on what it means in terms of their polling or their sense of where they're at. Just I fully admit that I am not the kind of political demographer, pollster, strategist. You know, I've been proved wrong on my predictions of what voters are going to do, not just in the United States but abroad as well. That I'm completely chastened. Don't put too much stock by what my readings of that sort of thing. But the gimmickiness, I think, is very clear, and I stand by that.
This week, Sohrab Ahmari, founder and editor of Compact, announced his forthcoming book with HarperCollins, The Triumph of Normal. It explores how the human yearning for faith, family, community, and the normal life endures amid efforts to extinguish it. The book also offers a roadmap for strengthening American normality. Sohrab, what is this normality of which you speak? Just give us a little taste, a little tease. I'm sure we'll be hearing a lot more about it in months to come. We're really excited for the publication, but just clue in our readers on what to expect.
Yeah, I've never done a podcast this early in the life of a book. When it's just
It is never too early to promote
to hawk something. But so it's thanks to Matthew's kindness that we are talking about it. But yeah, I mean the book is a defense of the concept of normal as normative, as like what in the colloquial sense of it. I argue that has value. But I say so, with full awareness that referring to someone as a normal guy or a normal family is actually really, really a relatively recent phenomenon. It happened beginning of the mid 20th century. Even the use of the word normal as we use it itself, it only dates to the 19th century, and it began as a term in medicine to try to attempt to describe what the normal condition of the human organism or any organism is, and what its pathological or abnormal state is, which is a much more difficult question than you might think, or a much more fraught and complicated question than you might think. And it's a normalcy is a product of the enumeration of the world, our ability in the 19th century to begin to understand the world or attempt to understand the world in a systematically statistical way, which itself arose out of games of chance, in terms of its kind of philosophical origins. But in the 19th century, you had this kind of what the philosopher Ian Hanking calls an avalanche of numbers, where people were just starting to kind of publish statistics about anything. And typically, what was normal was what the was how a certain phenomenon, whether or not it mapped toward the middle of these kind of parabola shaped graphs, and what fell on the outskirts or the outlying areas, what was considered abnormal or pathological, and so on. So to say, in a way, to say the triumph of normal, um, I realize it could be read as a tautology, right? It's like, well, at any given point, if you map the frequency of any phenomenon, there's going to be a set that's going to fall, in the middle, and that's normal, and there will always be that. So then, what does it mean to tout the triumph of normal? So, you know, I'm trying to argue that when ordinary people use the term normal, they actually refer to a set of more enduring ideas, um, about what makes people happy. And that's the fact that we are political animals. We're religion, meaning we are we cannot but do politics. We organize ourselves politically. We're a religious animal. We worship. We're a social animal. We thrive in family and community, and we're an economic animal. We like to make stuff and remake the world and shape creation. And so on the one, so sorry, this is why it's dangerous to talk about a book at this very early stage. But on the one hand, I think the book will argue that it will share some of the critiques of normalcy as it took shape in the 19th century. At the same time, um, it 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 adopts normalcy as in its colloquial, ordinary sense, as a statement about what's normative about human beings across time. And I will argue that a lot of conservatives who are worried that sense of normalcy is going away have too little trust in human nature. That if, like, the Soviets couldn't wipe out Islam in Central Asia, in 1926 you had 40,000 mosques in Central Asia. By 1941, there were only 1,000 left. But now, fast forward several decades, and mosques are once more dotting Central Asia. If the Soviets couldn't do it, then you know conservatives need to relax a little bit, because if you really believe that these things are normative for human beings in an enduring way, these values of a religious animal, political animal, social animal, economic animal, then they're not so fragile as you think. And sometimes the defenses of normalcy that have come from the right are, I will argue, are themselves abnormal and make normal seem unpleasant and not something that is actually winsome. At the same time, I'll argue that that said, America's ability to normalize its citizens relative to whatever set of norms you want, whether it's progressive or conservative, is faltering. And that's because of the collapse of the paternal function. It's because of the collapse of mass media, so the fragmentation of the media, the assault on traditional psychiatry, which And by that, I mean like traditional talk therapy, and the way that it insisted that people come to terms with reality. Instead, we had this kind of mode of psychiatry that merely affirms people and then medicates them, and so on. So that's the book. And I'll just say one last thing: is the origins of the book are pandemic related. And what I mean by that is we've been through the pandemic officially ended in, depending on whom you ask, in late 2022 or early 2023. We are now, as we're recording this, is October 2024, almost 2025. And I was one of the people who thought that a really horrifying new abnormal is here to stay when we were going through the pandemic. Like there was various signs of that we wouldn't be allowed to worship anymore, that family formation would collapse because people would just not be able to meet ever again and without masks and so on. And there were also people on the other side who welcomed this. They saw this as this utopian possibility. Actually, both camps were wrong, right? We just muddled back. The fact that we're actually back to where we are, this far out from a pandemic that saw such dramatic social transformations, is pretty remarkable. So that's how the book begins. And I know that best because that's the part I've written where it's like, we thought it's going to be really dramatic, and like, yeah, it's pretty crazy how in retrospect, how the status quo ante of normalcy has reasserted itself now in 2024. So that's like the tease of the book, and perhaps the worst author's introduction to a book ever. But in my defense, I've literally like put down 1,000 words. So, this is unusual to speak so early about a project at this stage.
It's a really exciting project. Obviously, it's going to take shape in new ways as you interact with the sources you're drawing on and work with your editor. I'm very excited for it, in part because I think I grew up in a culture that really valued the idea of the normal. That's what was valorized in the kind of small town Nebraska culture I grew up in. There was this idea that we were, normal Americans, and that was to be valued and prized, and you didn't want to be abnormal. And that's not exactly the case in every background. You could have a more kind of bohemian identity or something, but certainly in my own cultural context, being normal was valued, and that was kind of embodied in a figure like Coach Tom Osborne, the coach of the Nebraska Cornhuskers during my youth, who, uh, you know, obviously he's a white straight male. He was a devout Christian of sorts, but not really in a hard-edged or even really evangelical revivalist way. He was more of an ironic Methodist, certainly a conservative and a supporter of free markets, but racially progressive in a kind of conservative and individualistic way, right? Believing that you should avoid racial prejudice, as the coach of many black players and a close collaborator with black coaches, thinking that it's individual character that counts. And so a certain kind of progressive but traditional vision, a kind of uh, moderate conservatism. And I think this is obviously only one account of what it means to be normal. And anytime you have an account of the normal, it's going to be culturally contingent in certain ways and limiting in certain ways. But there also were elements of that tradition and of that kind of insistence on normalcy that I think were relatively successful, and somewhat admirable. Not least, it's kind of democratic self-understanding. It's openness, if moderate and limited in certain ways, to racial integration, to other forms of toleration. So I think that's just one really uh, kind of culturally specific idea of what it is to be normal. And I think a project taking that on at a deeper level is really fascinating. And this is a great moment for it.
And it's incredible now that Osborne is running for the Senate, right, in Nebraska.
Right. So the Tom Osborne was once a congressman in the state, and now there's a Dan Osborne, no relation, who's running for Senate in the state. And Tom Osborne, the older, uh, the coach, has put out an ad for the Republican candidate on behalf of the Republican candidate, saying, "I'm not related to Dan Osborne because Dan Osborne is an independent and progressive." And so Tom Osborne is standing up for the Republican. Tom Osborne has made a political intervention against legalized sports betting in the state. So that's one of the elements of that that idea of normal America that I certainly celebrate and identify with. It's skepticism of sports betting and marijuana use and things like that.
But just so there's no fake news on the Compact podcast, I was joking, not the same Osborne, but there is a fear that there's some association among Republicans, that there's a mental association between the two men, as I understand it.
Yes, and that has been the case in the past. Bob Casey, the former governor of Pennsylvania, I can't recall now, and I'm not able to look it up, but either he initially got votes because he had the same name as another Bob Casey, or, and I think this is what it was, there was a Bob Casey who was elected a county treasurer or something, just because he happened to have the same name as the governor, and he basically held that office in perpetuity because people associated him with the other Casey. So certainly just certainly just happening to have the right name can be a big advantage in a political contest. Uh, our high information society, where people are always making fully informed choices. And on the big screen, there are big flops. Megalopolis, the uh, vanity project of sorts from Francis Ford Coppola, was reviewed in our pages by Ross Barkin in an article titled "In Praise of Megalopolis." Also, Joker 2 hasn't been doing so well. Geoff, why is the praiseworthy Megalopolis turning off audiences?
So yeah, I think it's praiseworthy mostly for its ambition and sort of conception, but not really its execution. And Ross, more or less says this in the review. The reason it was a great piece for him to write is that he had previously written both for us and in the New York Times about the legacy of Robert Moses, the great urban planner of the 20th century, who really single-handedly reshaped New York City. And one way of looking at Megalopolis is it's essentially a sort of semi-futuristic narrative about a Robert Moses-like figure, played by Adam Driver, who is, it's without getting too deep into it, it's the names and some of the aesthetics are borrowed from ancient Rome. Um, and so that there is a kind of sense that, and the city is, while it is New York, it is referred to as New Rome, and it's set in a kind of retro future, we might say. And there's a lot that's very strange and doesn't really add up, but it does kind of pose these interesting questions about the future of cities, what cities should be and become, on this almost kind of metaphysical level, where there are these sort of questions about time and the way that architects and urban designers, in a sense, freeze time by creating these vast monumental structures that fix in one place a certain vision of how a human occupied space should be. And in a sense, the protagonist, played by Adam Driver, is attempting to kind of look beyond this and to envision a city that would somehow be dynamic and constantly in a state of flux and transformation. So there is something kind of fascinating about this concept, and just about, I suppose, the kind of reflection on creative ambition and vision that is obviously related to Francis Ford Coppola's own career, which he really did this as a kind of capstone for. which is strange insofar as, I recently saw The Conversation, the great 1974 film, which was re-released in a um, new version recently and was in the theater. I got to go see it. It's just a phenomenal,
Yeah,
incredibly
didn't realize
masterful film.
it had been re-released. Yeah,
Yes,
such a masterpiece.
truly an incredible film, and it was another one that Coppola really envisioned. It was very much his creature, and he got the opportunity to do it after The Godfather, which was of course also kind of his vision, but was based on the story from Mario Puzo. The Conversation was, I think, pretty much entirely his conception, and it's such a radically different film than Megalopolis. It's hard to imagine that the same person could have come up with this. I mean, it's far more, even though it touches on themes like that is very prescient in touching on themes of surveillance and privacy and sort of the ways the technology compromises those, in a way that's extremely powerful to look back on, you know, with this much distance, of half a century. It's it's an incredibly subtle film. There are long sequences of silence or of kind of where you have these people involved in surveillance just trying to listen in on conversation from a great distance and fiddling with the frequencies of these mics that they've put around. And so there are these long sequences of just trying to decipher signal from noise is sort of a main theme of it. Whereas, in a sense, the problem with Megalopolis in part is that it pontificates a great deal. Its characters pontificate a great deal. It's completely unsubtle. But but in any case, there is something kind of fascinating just about both the ambition of the film and its its kind of failure to realize that ambition in a way that is broadly appreciated, and at the same time the way that reflects back on the career of this filmmaker, who has really, through his films like The Conversation, The Godfather films, Apocalypse Now, has sort of transformed our culture in a very powerful way. And so, it's interesting to see a film that's reflects that kind of grandiosity and is about that kind of grandiosity, and at the same time is a box office flop. Although there is already some talk of it, that that I read a piece in I can't remember which publication, but about a screening in Manhattan where it was clear there had kind of that a cult had begun to develop. I mean, I went to see it in the theater, and there was definitely but I think once it had closed in quite a few theaters, the ones that remained were actually pretty full. So the one I went to was packed actually, and it seemed there were some people who'd seen it previously. So it seems to be developing this kind of cult reputation, and it may go on to be one of these kind of films that is, it develops a cult following partly because of the ways that it's dramatically quite bad. It was compared to Showgirls, which in this piece I read by the Paul Verhoeven Vegas movie, which is, which I think is a great movie, but was widely panned and a flop upon its release. And nevertheless, gradually attracted this kind of cult following of devotees who partly were just kind of fascinated by the specific qualities of its badness, or its weirdly just kind of incomprehensible elements. And there's a lot of that in Megalopolis, just these sequences of dialogue that are, have been much kind of memeified and shared in video form, which are, just bizarre and incomprehensible. So it's a weird sort of monument to ambition, both on the level of the story and, in terms of the backstory of how Coppola made the film. And so to that extent, I think is quite a fascinating cultural document, and about the role of the individual artist and creator in a context in which the figure of the auteur, the cinematic auteur, who Coppola really embodied the kind of generation of auteurs who were influenced by post-war European film, and kind of carved out these unique visions starting in the 60s through the 70s. he really embodied that figure. He's now made as the capstone of his career this very strange film, which is not really going to be liked for having the qualities that are associated with his best films from his sort of classic period. But it is kind of an interesting reflection on this kind of dying breed of auteurs and their overarching ambition and kind of grandiosity and megalomania. So that's that one, which I have seen. Joker, Folie à Deux, I have not seen. I will probably try to go see it before it leaves the theater. But what strikes me about that one is it's coming as the somewhat belated sequel to the 2019 Joker, which I've always thought of as a very interesting kind of pivot point in culture and the national conversation. It was released in late 2019, so just before the COVID lockdowns. It begat all, it provoked all of the kind of sense of cultural fragility and vulnerability to the dangerous kind of dark forces associated with the rise of Donald Trump and the alt-right and incels and mass shooters and things like that. And so it's interesting to me that the film was such an event when it appeared, and it produced so much controversy, and in some way that seemed to be part of the kind of marketing of it. That it was sort of designed to create all of these anxiety, to kind of play on all of these cultural anxieties and kind of create a viral sensation by doing that. And so it's interesting to me both that the new film is on one hand, completely failing to uh, produce a similar kind of event, but also, from what I understand of it, in some ways kind of defied that expectation as well. I mean, among other things, it's a musical, which is bizarre. It's a courtroom drama in parts. So it's sort of, deliberately plays against the kind of selling points of the first Joker, which was in a way this kind of archetypal tale of alienation in the lineage of urban alienation in the lineage of Taxi Driver and various other films that had to do with alienated men kind of lashing out, acting out against society, and was set in this kind of New York of the 1970s, but at the same time was kind of was very much about the kind of character of male alienation that you were finding on the internet in that period, in which it become a major subject of unease. And so, part of what's fascinating to me about the new Joker and its reception, again, I haven't seen the film yet, but is just the way that it completely failed to, and also in some ways, as far as I can tell, seemed to work against kind of trying to resuscitate that cultural moment around itself, and instead seems to not know what it's supposed to be or what kind of niche it's supposed to occupy in the culture, or what the first one really tied into these broader conversations in the culture and tapped into them very powerfully, regardless of how good of a film you think it was. It certainly succeeded on that level. And so it's interesting to me. I mean, perhaps it speaks to something Sohrab was speaking about earlier, this kind of reversion to normal, that there's some kind of sense that like this this narrative that's kind of this mythified version of this like radical alienation and kind of socially destructive energy, embodied in this figure of the Joker, who embodied those forces in an earlier moment, as played by Heath Ledger, in a moment that kind of spoke to the kind of anti-establishment populist feelings of the Occupy moment, actually. And then again kind of in the late 2010s, congealing around the first Joaquin Phoenix Joker. So it's interesting to me that like this film doesn't seem to be succeeding in tapping into any of those concerns. It's just it's as if whatever conversation it was part of, it's kind of been set adrift from, or maybe that conversation has just died out too much. So it's fascinating to me that kind of that contrast with the release of the first film or almost exactly 5 years ago, just as a kind of barometer of cultural shifts.
I guess I'll only say I'm a little bit worried because we are not in the context of Showgirls, the mid '90s anymore, and so you worry every time studios take a risk on something that's not like Spider-Man 87, whatever kind of iteration we're on now. And if it fails, then they'll make the conclusion that they should just make more Spider-Man franchise films. That said, this comes also against the backdrop of a bunch of really successful movies that don't fit that mold, that franchise mold, like Oppenheimer and Barbie last summer, neither of which was that kind of a movie. And by last summer, I mean summer 2023. And yet, they succeeded wildly. And there continue to be, these small scale movies that get funded and do very well, but overall I think there's reason to be worried about the loss of the kind of middle movie and mid in the book market they call it the mid-list book, and that's like my book. I as an author am pegged as a mid-list author, and so are most of the like typical nonfiction authors that you read. So I guess in publishing is somewhat squeezed, but it goes on. But in the movie industry, there's been this long-standing fear, which will be, I think, deepened by the outcome of something like Megalopolis, by its box office outcome, that there will only be like very, very tiny independent, barely distributed art films and intellectual films, and then franchises. And the kind of mid-market movie that's more creative and intellectual but pitched at a broad audience is going to die out. So like if you like think about all your favorite movies from the 1990s or the first decade of the 21st century, there a lot of them were in that mold, right? It's like the Andy Kaufman movie Man on the Moon, or Traffic by Soderbergh. It's just like all these kind of movies where the studio isn't spending $400 million to make it, but it's also not spending $40,000. It's spending like 20 or spending like 40 and recouping it decently enough to do more of it. And I, notwithstanding the success of the Oppenheimer and the Barbies, which by the way, I think Oppenheimer was a massively expensive movie anyway, but just movies that aren't dumb franchise movies, notwithstanding those successes, I continue to worry about the loss of that movie. And I know when I say mid-market or mid-list, that's a publishing term. It's not a movie industry term. I'm not a movie industry person, so I don't know what they call it, but like not the giant and not the tiny independent movie. That middle, whatever that is I think the most valuable part of Hollywood filmmaking, and it is threatened, and Megalopolis will not help.
I haven't seen Coppola's previous ambitious flop, The Cotton Club. Anyone on here seen that? No, it'd be kind of interesting. I also think a bit of the infamous kind of new Hollywood flop, Michael Cimino's Heaven's Gate, which I have seen and is amazing in the just uh, luxuriousness of the means it employs and the kind of very minor and bizarre effects it achieves with all the talent and money that went into it. So there is, and that's a bit of a fun watch if you are willing to occasionally laugh at a film. So maybe Megalopolis is headed toward a similar fate.
Another bizarre one is Ridley Scott's The Counselor, which was the only screenplay by Cormac McCarthy, and a star-studded cast of Javier Bardem, Cameron Diaz, various others, and it's another one that was Michael Fassbender, another one that was broadly considered just a complete disaster of a film. So I'm always interested in these, and that one's notable as well because it involves this fascinating collaboration of Ridley Scott and Cormac McCarthy somehow coming up with a complete dud that doesn't really much resemble either of their works except in brief periods of this kind of philosophical rumination that's very vintage McCarthy. So
I had no idea this film existed. That is, that's incredible.
Jeff,
that-
that's the one where he wrote it as a screenplay, right? Like it's not a novel.
I believe, yes, that's right. Yeah, there was no novel it was based on. Another, just while we're on the subject of weird, grandiose flops, another one that I like to point out is The Canyons, which, like The Counselor, came out in 2013, which is a extremely bad erotic thriller directed by Paul Schrader and written by Bret Easton Ellis. Just tremendously terrible, but kind of worth a viewing.
It looks good.
Starring Lindsay Lohan.
Oh my goodness! Well, how did I miss this?
So, any other flops and kind of star-studded disaster movies we should recommend for our listeners?
Yeah, I think ensemble cast movies in general don't do too well, do they? Well, I don't know. Crash did very well. Not the body horror movie.
The Cronenberg Crash.
Yeah, no, like the sort of melodrama Crash.
Paul Haggis, yeah.
Paul Haggis's melodrama, or well, no, I'm just thinking of lots of ensemble cast movies that actually did very well. So I don't know why I said that. I'm just trying to think of big movies that failed, and I'm struggling to come up with more on this Wednesday afternoon at 4:11 p.m.
Well, with that, thank you, Geoff, Sohrab, and thanks, listeners. For more, go to compactmag.com/subscribe.